I'd like to welcome everyone to today's Tech Talk from Nastel Technologies, entitled Painless Migration and Maintenance Strategies with WebSphere MQ7.1 and 7.1 to 7.5. It's going to cover, among other things, the three important items to consider when migrating to 7.1, 7.5, and you're doing that from WMQ 7.0. Also, how to apply maintenance to one queue manager without affecting all of them. And in addition, how to back out maintenance without having to restore the queue manager environment. This is an on-demand Tech Talk as well, so you'll find this on our website and available for viewing and listening at any time. As you may know, this is part of a series of Tech Talks that Nastel is doing. We have another one coming up on November 28th at 11 a.m. And this one is done by Albert Mavashev. Albert Mavashev is our CTO, and his Tech Talk will be on Java Garbage Collection, CMS, versus G1 in Java 7. And Richard Nicola, our VP of Engineering, who's doing today's session, has another one coming up on December 12th. And that session's called Leveraging Your Mainframe into the 22nd Century. And we're all excited to hear what that one's about. So at this point, I'm going to say, take it, Richard.
Welcome to the Tech Talk, Painless Migration and Maintenance Strategies with WebSphere MQ 7.1 and 7.5. I'm Richard Nicola from Nastel Technologies. This is one of several Tech Talks in the 7.1 and 7.5 series. We started out with a general introduction of the new features of 7.1 and 7.5. We then specifically looked at running multiple versions, as well as taking advantage of new features beyond the multiple versions in 7.1 and 7.5. This Tech Talk is on migration strategies. The previous ones are also available for download if you'd like to review those. So today we're going to talk about planning for migration. Basically, we want to make you the hero in regards to the 7.1 or 7.5 installation. We're going to start by talking about how to get from where you are to 7.1 or 7.5. Now you'll see that specifically I referenced 7.5. That's because pretty much anyone that hasn't started this process is going to go to 7.5. Obviously, if you're in the middle of a 7.1 migration, you can certainly continue to move along that path. And then we'll look briefly at ongoing maintenance strategies as new updates come out for 7.1 or 7.5. So we're going to start with preparation. Now, the first step in this migration is planning, and more planning. You basically need to determine what needs to be done. You need to define the responsible parties for each of the significant steps, as well as defining who needs to be involved. Identifying the timelines for that process. And again, because you're dealing with multiple people here, sometimes the operations staff, the applications, and even the users, scheduling time becomes very important. So the timelines and when you do things needs to be identified. And then, of course, the key thing is you need a backout strategy, right? If something doesn't go the way that you expect, how do you get back to a running system? The next thing you want to do is identify your dependencies. Specifically, do you have any third-party software that's going to be release dependent? Do you have application dependencies that need to be considered? Well, MQ is generally application independent. There are periodically dependencies or application usage that needs to be reviewed for compatibility. A lot depends, again, which version you're migrating from and to that will make some of these dependencies apparent. Similarly, what about bundled or integrated products? So things like brokers that need to be upgraded or changed, or usage with PubSub and all those varying things that have come along, or any other integrated software that you've purchased that uses MQ. And then finally, of course, you have to be prepared for breakage. And much like our stack of packages here on the right, what's happened over time with your MQ environment is you've added pieces, you've stacked them together, and they all fit together, but they're not necessarily designed to be used together. And one piece may fall off and break, which is enough to, of course, ruin the entire stack. We'll actually see there's 4 different strategies that you could use to migrate from the very basic single stage on a server, which is basically an over-the-top install, a multiple stage install where you're using multiple queue managers on multiple servers, or a multiple stage where you're using multiple queue managers on a single server, and then side-by-side migration. And we'll review all of these in detail. The latter 2 specifically are going to be only available if you're starting from a 7015 and higher system. So again, we'll see these in more detail as we go through. Other things to consider are things like OS clustering. Now, you can't upgrade a queue manager even if it's running on a different instance in the cluster, right? So if you failed over, you want to update, say, the primary, well, that's not acceptable because the file systems are actually being shared and in use. You can't run if that queue manager is basically running. You can't back it up if it's running, right? So you have to, again, you have to plan this as for the actual outage to have occurred, and you can't start a lower version, which means if you did do a partial upgrade and then had to fail over in the middle of that, you may not be able to actually run the queue manager because the file systems again have been updated for the data. You can't run the lower version of the software. Similarly, if you're using MQ clustering, there are some considerations, although they are generally compatible, so you don't have to be concerned so much from the compatibility standpoint. You do need to make sure that you schedule and you know which of the cluster components you're upgrading first and the implications of that. You may also need to look at application affinities. That is, when work starts getting routed to a specific member of a cluster in a workload balancing situation, if there's an application affinity, it will continue to route to that member of the cluster. And of course, if you're taking that member out, that'll obviously have an implication. And then, of course, if you're using multiple instance queue managers, the active and the standby versions need to be at the same level. And of course, you have the same considerations above that they can't necessarily be running because they in fact are sharing the same file system for the data. Some other things to consider is that migration is a one-way street in most cases, right? So the only way you can go backwards is by backing up and restoring your environment. Also, you have to stop all of the applications, and that includes obviously the local applications, as well as any client applications that happen to be connected to this queue manager, as well as remote applications. So things that depend on this queue manager, like the clustering example I mentioned earlier, or anything else, right? Because when you're done, you basically have to have, everything stopped, a clean road, and then you can move forward. So again, one of the reasons that scheduling is very important. Here's a chart out of the IBM doc, specifically talking about the different versions that you could be coming from and going to. And the nice thing about this chart is it in fact has links. So if you brought this up, you can link, you can directly link to the pertinent topic. And on the left-hand side is the version you're coming from. So for example, you can go from 5.3, and yes, I'm sure there are still a few of you out there running with 5.3 systems. You can actually only go to 6.0 or 7. There's not a direct path to 7.01 or 7.5 available for 5.3 users. For 6, you can generally go to any of the versions, so you can upgrade to 7.5 or migrate to 7.5. And so on. Now you will notice that that you can't go backwards, right? So there is no 7.1 to version 6 or upgrade. It's only again, as I mentioned, it's a one-way path. For ZOS, you have the same basic chart. You can again, for 5.3, you've got basically you're going to go to version 6. From version 6, you can go to 7.1 or 7.5. Well, sorry, 7.1 because this is ZOS. There is no 7.5 on ZOS. So you can go to 7.1, which is the latest ZOS release. You'll also notice, though, that it in fact does have some ability to go back because of the way that ZOS is constructed. The migration paths are a little bit different, and so you can go back, assuming that you've not taken advantage of some of the new features in your environment. So you do have that option available to you. Okay, so let's drill down a little bit more in the details of execution. And I mentioned these earlier. The first one we're going to talk about is a single stage migration. And basically a single stage migration refers to basically installing over the top of your server with new MQ libraries. So if you're a version 6 or a version 7.0.15 and earlier, this is your only option. You basically are going to upgrade all of the queue managers on that server at one time, and the conversion happens when the queue manager restarts. So you shut everything down, as we mentioned earlier. You shut all of the applications down. You apply the latest version of MQ, and then you restart queue managers, and they will be migrated during restart. There is no going back, so of course you want to make sure that you have a very good backup, in case of problems, which of course in this case involves all queue managers on this server. So you're going to have to, basically back up the entire environment and do the upgrade. And if all goes well, you move forward. Another option is multiple stage. Now, there are two options with multiple stage. One is that if you're running one of the older versions, you can certainly do a multiple stage using different servers. And so you're basically going to create a new server. You're going to put a new, say, 7.5 installation on that server, and then you're going to create a new queue manager on that in that server. Then what you're going to do is you're going to copy all of the definitions that are required from the original queue manager to your new queue manager. You're going to move and change the applications, spelling error there. You're going to move and change the applications as needed so that they can use the new platform and the new servers. And of course, the thing here is that you've introduced a fair amount of risk from misconfigurations, but at the advantage of you're not disrupting anything, right? From a running perspective, right? You're running applications, your queue managers still run the same versions. Everything that you haven't moved over to the new environment is still running the same configuration. Okay? And again, because of this, you now need some way you can actually move, all of your definitions across. So you either need to copy and paste as shown here, or you need some other artifacts that you use to move those queue manager definitions from queue manager to queue manager. Okay. Now, just as an example, this is an example of a single stage migration. You can see here that we're going from a 6.0.2.9 installation up to 7.5, and of course the installation comes up and says, nope, the only way you can do that is to do a over this top. You can't do a coexistence install. So in fact, as you can see here, the only option that I'm given is the ability to upgrade the MQ configuration. If the existing installation is 7.0.1.6 or higher, it does provide two additional options for migration. The first is the side-by-side migration. In this case, you're going to create a new MQ installation. Now, for details on this, you'll want to see the Tech Talk on coexistence, which goes into more detail specifically on creating MQ installations. Once you do that, you're going to create new queue managers and verify the operation. Okay, so you're basically using this new installation as a side-by-side operation with the existing queue managers. However, when you are then ready and you feel that the environment is ready for migration, you basically uninstall the original version, so 7016 for example, and you replace it with the new installation. So you're actually going to replace the existing MQ. So it's just basically the same as the single stage install, except you've had the opportunity now to test out this server. Once you do that replacement, you do the migration, again just like the single stage migration, and you migrate all of your queue managers at once to the new environment. So it is introduced the risk similar to a single stage migration, but you at least had the opportunity to do the verification to make sure that the installation was set up properly, that it was working as expected, and so on. And finally, you have the ability to do multiple stage on the same server. In this case, again, you're going to create a new MQ installation. You may optionally create new queue managers. The primary reason for this would be to deploy new applications to those queue managers. But again, you could also be using those to test out and verify the environment. And then once you're ready to go, you're going to migrate your queue managers to the new installation, and you're going to do this one by one rather than in mass as we did in the side by side. So basically, you're going to pick the queue managers that you're ready to migrate, and you're going to move them to the new installation. Now, one of the disadvantages of this approach is that in fact you will have two separate installations or more of MQ. So, for example, you'll see down here on the bottom that if you're running the IBM WebSphere MQ Explorer, you actually have two different versions of the MQ Explorer to run, with each with its own set of queue managers that you need to manage. Now, again, obviously, if you're using other tools, they may have a different approach as to how they manage this environment. But the key point is that you actually will be running multiple versions on this server. Now, if you watch the Tech Talk on coexistence, you'll have seen this diagram before. This basically is just referring to the fact that MQ supports this concept of having multiple installations installed on the same system, so you can have different applications connecting to different queue managers at different versions of MQ. Now, a key part of this is this application installation loading that's shown here, and the key point about this is as long as you're running 7.1 or higher libraries, that they actually have the ability to load any version of MQ based on the installations that are installed on the system. And that includes both higher and lower versions of MQ. And so the advantage, of course, when you're doing a side-by-side implementation, as long as all of the libraries are set up to connect to 7.1, is the applications don't have to change just simply because they're connecting to a different installation. MQ will actually load the appropriate libraries for those applications based on the installation that's required. And again, just as an example, here's a Windows install. You can see we're doing a coexistence install where we're choosing to leave the existing version untouched. Again, we could have done a single stage install, but here we've chosen to actually install a new installation called installation 1, and then we can pick queue manager by queue manager which queue manager we want to use within the 7.5 environment. Okay, as promised, here one last topic regarding maintenance level migration. The distinction here is we're talking about applying a 7.5.1 or a 7.1.1 on top of an existing installation. The good news is that you now have, with the multiple stage migration, the ability to basically move queue manager by queue manager through the system. you can pre-install both the the existing version as well as the maintenance upgrade at the same time on the same systems. And you can selectively choose which queue managers are migrated to that new maintenance level for their usage. As a result, the impact is reduced, while at the same time the installation loading is taking care of any application dependencies. Also, with this technique, your clustered OS clustered as well as multi-instance queue managers may continue to run because they're on the non-active, assuming they're on the non-active instance, they can be upgraded. And so, basically you'll be able to switch the libraries while the queue managers continue to run. And of course, backout is now possible as well within the same command level. Now, there are exceptions to both of those. There are times when you won't be able to apply the maintenance with multiple instance queue managers, or it may specifically say that you're not a backout is not possible. But in the general case, you will be able to do that. Now, there is some other news. I don't want to call it bad news because it is actually not bad. The first is that you still have to plan. This doesn't give you the carte blanche to do whatever you want. You still obviously need to plan and make sure that you know the procedures you're going to go through to upgrade. If you're not using a multi-instance queue manager, you're still going to have to stop the application instances in order to switch the queue manager over. One of the other things to consider is that your queue managers are actually now running on different installations. As I mentioned in one of the earlier slides, you actually, may have, one queue manager running on installation 1, one queue manager running on installation 2, and another one running on installation 3. And so when you're going to move those through different environments, you need to know which levels they're at. There are 2 new commands, or I should say extensions to the DSPMQ command. You can use a -O all, or there's some specific options you can select, which will show you all of the queue managers that are installed, what installation they're associated with, whether they're multi-instance, and so on. And then there's a DSP MQ-A, which you can use to determine the status of the queue managers that are in the current installation. Okay, and with that, we've reached the end of the presentation, and I will open it up for questions. Okay, our first question is, when defining multiple stage migration, what determines which queue manager is associated with which version of MQ? Okay, so that is a good question. So initially, since you're doing a multiple stage or a multiple installation migration, each queue manager is first going to be associated with the original installation. Okay, so whatever you were originally running, 7016 or 710, that's going to be the version the queue manager is associated with. Then to change that, that's when you're going to need to stop the queue manager. You're going to use the command set mqm, which is going to then associate it with the installation required. When you restart the queue manager, at that point it will be migrated to the version of MQ associated with the installation that you just assigned it to. Okay, our next question is, what happens to messages that were in flight at the time of migration? In this case, the answer is the same thing as any normal MQ restart. Persistent messages are going to be retained or backed out according to the processing. Your non-persistent messages are lost, and so on. Because in fact, message recovery and the proper processing of messages is one of the key factors when when you look at the charts and say which version is supported for migration tasks. Okay. The next question is, can you provide an example of an application dependency? Okay, yeah, so in this case, there are very few, fortunately, application dependencies, but there are a few. An example might be a difference between, say, an expectation of using 32 or 64-bit interfaces. JMS support changed between version 6 and 7. And applications, of course, can do anything, so they might actually be written to handle, specific command or message versions, and that could cause them could cause an issue. Now, obviously, that's not a good technique, but there certainly are applications that do that. Okay, one final question. It says, which technique do you recommend for migrating for 701 to 75? Okay, yeah. So there is no single answer to that question. Each of the migration techniques has its own benefits and risks. Single stage is easiest because it's one step and it's done, right? And if all goes well, you're done. But of course, if things don't work, then you have to recover everything. So it's a bigger risk factor, but obviously it's the easiest. The side-by-side reduces some of that risk, but it actually adds additional work, and ultimately you're going to do about the same thing. And the multiple stage on single server is probably the most attractive. It's certainly going to be the choice for any maintenance type upgrades in the future, because it lets you on a queue manager by queue manager basis do that migration. Now again, there is additional administration tasks, and there are other tasks associated with it, but certainly is the one I would recommend for any ongoing migrations. Okay, and it looks as if we have no additional questions at this time. So Charlie, back to you.
Thank you, Richard. That was very insightful. As we mentioned earlier, this is an on-demand Tech Talk and will be available on our website for download and viewing anytime you like. Our upcoming Tech Talk in the series is Java Garbage Collection, CMS versus G1 in Java 7. That'll be done by Albert, our CTO. And then Richard, as I mentioned earlier, is back on deck on December 12th with Leveraging Your Mainframe into the 22nd Century. Please look for additional topics on nastel.com, and we look forward to your suggestions for future topics for future Tech Talks. Thank you very much.